So that's the situation with the Greek bailout, but European leaders are also about to launch into another highly controversial set of negotiations. We are, of course, talking about Brexit. Now, those talks are due to begin on Monday, and one of the first things that's expected to happen is that Brussels is going to present the UK with a massive bill to leave the Union. Now, estimates of how much that may come to have varied, but the Financial Times now says the 27 remaining EU countries are preparing a tough opening gambit. Let's take a look. The European Commission estimates that the UK owes Europe $97 billion in financial commitments it made as a member state. Now, these include things like road and rail projects the UK has yet to pay for. Now, Brussels is also likely to ask for another $13 billion in so-called contingent liabilities. This is effectively insurance in the event that any country defaults on its loans from the EU. And the EU may also demand another $2 billion to go towards other development projects, both in the EU and outside it. The total gross demand, then, an enormous $112 billion. But the EU also owes the UK plenty of money, with rebates and counting the value of the UK's share of European assets, such as the EU headquarters in Brussels. The final bill may come down to around $67 billion. Let's break this down a little further now with Geraint Johnes. He's a professor of economics at Lancaster University, and he joins me now from the UK. Geraint, thank you so much for joining us here on Money Talks. That gross amount that we talked about there, $112 billion, it's a rather larger amount than people like Jean-Claude Juncker had talked about a couple of months ago. What happens if on day one the UK says, we're not going to pay you a penny?
Well, hello, Azhar. Yes, indeed, it is larger than the sum that was being talked about a few months ago, and different bits have been added on over the months as people get a feel for how much Britain ought to pay as part of this exit settlement. Now, it's quite possible that the British negotiators could go in and play hardball. There's been talk about them getting legal advice saying that they don't actually need to pay anything. But I think that's quite an unlikely strategy for the British negotiators to take, because the really important thing that Britain must get out of this is a trade deal. And if there's no exit payment, then there's no possibility that the European Union would agree to move forward towards a trade deal. So I do think it's likely that there will be some kind of settlement, and the real question to ask is how much will that be? And in answering that question, it's important, as you have done, to split the demand into its various component parts. So we've got some parts like 11 billion euros that is being claimed for pension payments to European bureaucrats, and it's the UK's share of paying those pension payments. That is something that I think inevitably the UK will need to pay and will want to contribute, because pensions in Europe are paid on a pay-as-you-go basis rather than there being a pension fund. There's also payments that are going to revolve around infrastructure, around agriculture payments, research and so on, projects that are already underway. And I would expect that the UK will need to make that kind of contribution to an exit payment. But then we've got other payments, such as running costs of the European Union over a couple of years after Britain will have left the European Union. And there's more wiggle room, more scope for negotiation around those payments. And you mentioned the contingency payments for things like the possibility of default from the bailout of Ireland, for instance. And that is a contingency that is unlikely ever to need to be paid. So there's quite a lot of wiggle room there to negotiate over.
You mentioned the trade talks. At the other extreme, there are people who say that, well, Britain should just basically pay up what it owes and move on to these very important trade negotiations. And bearing in mind that the total amount we're talking about, compared to the size of the UK economy, is actually only about 2.5% of the UK's GDP. Is that something that you agree with?
Inevitably, there's going to be a process of negotiation, and that is because it's not actually simple to work out how much Britain does owe Europe, or indeed how much the European Union will owe Britain for assets that are currently held in the European Union, in things like the European Investment Fund. So it's not a simple negotiation, and it is one that I imagine will take some time, and hopefully there will be an accommodation and we'll be able to move on then to agree some kind of trade deal with the European Union.
Professor Geraint Johnes, Lancaster University, thank you so much for joining us on Money Talks.